Good afternoon. This is our 416 Development and Growth 2. And the topic for today is institutions. So if you remember, we discussed first the sources of growth, right? We talked about capital accumulation, human capital, technology, and the other sources. And then we started discussing the fundamental causes, or the deep structural factors that affect that affect how countries accumulate such sources, right? So the overall picture is like this. There's one fundamental factor that we call geography, right? So geography is largely exogenous, as you know, and it affects institutions and perhaps culture, right? And institutions and culture also interact with each other. And all of these three things affect, so both geography, institutions, and culture, they affect how we accumulate technology, how we accumulate human capital, how we accumulate physical capital, and perhaps other stuff, right? So from fundamental causes to sources, we have this rather complicated stuff. So eventually, the growth rate, the long-run growth rate of the economy is determined through all these factors, right? And we already discussed geography in our last lecture. Okay, so today we want to talk about institutions. And when we say institutions, of course we have to define what an institution is and what is the function of an institution in determining the pace of technological progress or the pace of human capital accumulation in the economy, right? So one typical definition that is largely adopted by economists is that institutions are rules of the game, right? So you may imagine institutions as the rules of the game. So the game, what do we mean by game here? Well, this is the market interactions, the consumption activities, production activities, and all of the economic interactions that take place among economic agents, right? So there are households in the economy, there are firms, there's a government, there's a central bank, and there are other authorities, such as the capital board or the competition agency. I mean, you may imagine all this setup. There's this external world, the rest of the world, with which our economy interacts through trade, right, and the financial flows. So in this complicated picture of an economic world, there are certain games, right? So, I mean, interactions. Some of these are indeed games, as in the game theory, right? So strategic interactions matter, and if there are certain rules or conventions, so these rules do not have to be only written rules, but there could be also customs or conventions that regulate our behavior and that constrain our choices, right? So all of these could be thought of as part of the institutions. One useful way of categorizing institutions is to think of political institutions versus economic institutions. Okay, And when we think of political institutions, what we have in mind is things like um, I don't know, constitution, the laws, right, and the regulations. You know, the government itself is this huge institution that plays a large role, as we're going to discuss uh, today. And there are also, of course, economic institutions such as the market itself, as an economic institution. Money, uh, money usually can be think of as an institution itself, and the market exchange where we use a particular, uh, a particular medium of exchange uh, as the currency, uh, can be can be thought of uh, institutions, but also, for instance, the tax system in the economy, right, or the accounting system in the economy. So these are also can be considered as certain economic institutions. Another typology, another taxonomy is with formal versus informal institutions. Okay, and when we say formal institutions, uh, these are not, I mean, some of these are indeed institutions, right? So they have a building, they have this members, this set of members, the establishment principles, the vision, the mission, and some of these are informal. The things, the customs, conventions, the norms that we adhere when we are uh, exercising our economic activities. So these economic activities, again, is both consumption and production, and also in some markets in the economy, we supply certain stuff. In some other markets, we have demand for the stuff there. So there are formal and informal institutions that affect our choices and that govern our behavior. Okay, so this is the overall picture, and now we're gonna talk about one particular question: how can institutions affect uh, economic outcomes, right? And how institutions are affected by economic outcomes. All right. So the biggest issue that is still controversial, according to some economists, is that uh, whether income per capita uh, affects democratization, okay, or the relation is reversed, right? So which one is correct? So one of the earliest hypotheses uh, by Lipset, I think it was 50s. So Lipset argued that, so it is called the modernization hypothesis. Okay, so Lipset argued that once a country becomes economically developed, once a country gets richer and richer, then in that country we would observe the waves of democratization, right? So a country becoming, uh, you know, richer, so people in that economy would demand for certain economic rights, certain political rights. Education would expand, so more people become, uh, let's say, enlightened, right? So then they would have um, they would have a certain desire to have developed political institutions in the economy, right? So according to Lipset's hypothesis, the causality, the important concept here is causality, okay? Nedensellik in Turkish, right? So causality runs from economic development to um, democratization or political modernization, right? And there are economists, and most of them are highly influential economists, including Darwan Acemoğlu. So they argue that the causality basically runs from democratization and income per capita, right? Especially there is this new institutionalist framework that is associated with Douglas North and some others. So back in the late 60s and early 70s, that was a uh, rather lively literature. So these neo-institutionalist economics or new institutionalist economists today, including Darun Acemoğlu, Avner Greif, and I don't know, some others, uh, James Robinson, and many others are there. Tabellini, Person. So there are many other people out there. So they argue that causality runs in the reverse direction. So first, if a country has advanced political institutions and advanced economic institutions that support democratic values, a legal system that protects property rights, and if corruption is limited, if resources are used by the government in an efficient manner, and so on and so forth, if in other words, if political and economic institutions are already there to support modern economic growth, then that results in higher long run growth rates, right? So if people are ensured, if people's economic rights are protected, if so, these could be property rights in terms of establishing firms, increasing the capital stock of the firm, or it can be intellectual property rights, okay, or it could be rights to exercise your profession, right? So in terms of human capital, if you think about it, okay, there's a connection problems. Okay, Özgür, do you hear me now? Is it okay now? All right. Okay. Let me know if connection is poor. So all right. So what was I saying? So um, so property rights are important, right? So first, imagine that you're gonna be you know you're gonna establish a firm. You're an entrepreneur. So you must be ensured that the government will protect, or the legal system in the country will protect your entrepreneurial rights, right? So if you establish a firm by paying certain costs, then you are free to engage in production activities and marketing activities, right? And so on and so forth. Then you can increase the capital stock in your firm by investing, right? By making investment expenditures so that your firm uh, grows larger and serve bigger markets. So that's one thing. Another thing would be the rights to exercise your profession. So if you think of this as the human capital, right? So you go to the law school, or you go to the medical school, or you go to the business school, or the engineering school. So you obtain a diploma and a license to exercise your profession freely and without any pressure from government, or it will be legally possible to exercise your profession. Then you, of course, would be incentivized, right? If there's a market for it as well, then you will be incentivized to obtain that education. All right. And you must also think of this in terms of intellectual property rights. So if you want to invest in technology, okay, again, you're going to pay certain costs, right? And some of these costs are sunk costs, right? So you have to pay for these without even knowing for certain that the innovation will be successful. But there would be some expected return. Now, that expected return is important to incentivize you, right? That expected profit. But if the government is um, if the government is oppressive, if you are not sure whether your competitors, the firms, for instance, that you try to replace uh, by creating this new innovation, if these firms are protected by the government through the corrupt practices, then the government might actually block your innovation, right? Because you know the the established monopolies would be protected by the corrupt government, and so on and so forth, right? So then, so that type of uh, property rights argument was very popular in late 60s and early 70s, and it's still popular among many of the new institutionalists. But this literature is still, I mean, if you read the literature, there are many published papers and ongoing research that try to understand that uh, you know the, some other aspects of this issue. For instance, if we are thinking about democratization, we also ask whether it is stable or not, right? So there are some studies suggesting that if the democratization history is long, all right, then democracies that have this long history, such as the French democracy or the American democracy, they are stronger, right? But if the democratization process is rather new, if the democratic capital, uh, according to one popular concept, if the democratic capital is still very small, then it is very difficult to sustain uh, that type of democracy against, uh, military coups, or against civil war, or against, corrupt practices, or against, degeneration, cultural or institutional degeneration. So one particular research program, for instance, in more recent years, try to understand the very long run determinants of institutions in a country, right? Uh, and we already discussed geography is an important part of this. Why? Because the colonial era have still some effects, because one of the most important aspects of institutions is that institutions are quite resistant to change. Okay, once you establish a set of institutions, its evolution is very slow. Okay, this is true for bad institutions, and that is true for good institutions as well. Okay, and institutions are important for policy choices, because institutions determine what type of policies will be adopted by the governments, right? If there are uh, uh, strong checks and balances against the executive, against the executive branch of the state, the government itself, so then that government cannot be quite easily destruct property rights, right? Because there are certain laws and there are independent, uh, legal agencies in the economy that are protecting the rights of the people. Okay, but in many countries around the world, such legal institutions are not there. So governments have, uh, so the governments are restricted only a few uh, checks and balances in many countries. In many countries, there are military leaders in the power, or there are monarchs in the power, or there's a party state, right? So the state uh, is run uh, only by the officials of this dominant party, right? So then there's not much democratization, of course, in that country, and such governments uh, are usually corrupted governments, and they use the public resources for their own benefit. So it is not like the textbook assumption that governments are benevolent, right? So most governments in the real world are not benevolent because they have some other purpose to to achieve. So my inclination is to see that causality mainly running from institutions and income per capita, but I'm not totally disregarding the modernization hypothesis, because there are also, so the argument is that in an economy that gets richer and richer, people are also getting more educated, and in a modern life, uh, you know, becomes more stable there. So people have demands for certain rights, and they have more power to protect these rights. So the relationship is a bit complex. So I would rather recommend you to read certain papers in the literature. So if you make a couple of Google searches, or if you look at the published work by especially Daron Acemoğlu, he's one of the most influential institutionalists. And I already recommended you that you to read Şevket Pamuk's Uneven Centuries, because Uneven Centuries is a very nice institutionalist book that looks at Turkish economic history and Turkish economic development. So it is very informative. Now we have we have this setup of fundamental causes, geography, institutions, and culture. So they interact with each other as well, and they affect how people accumulate knowledge, how people accumulate human capital, how entrepreneurial an economy or a society is, and what is the total R&D expenditure, for instance, the share of total R&D expenditure within GDP, and so on and so forth. So these are affected, and the causality is, the causal mechanism is a bit complex, because there are certain factors that affect institutions, especially in the past, right? So there is institutional persistence, geography affect past institutions, and these past institutions have very slow, exhibit very slow evolution. So there is that present effect, and those effects create certain economic outcomes and political outcomes. All right. Now, one thing that you imagine is this. So suppose that there is a distribution of resources today. Okay, so T means today. All right. So distribution of resources are there, and political institutions, let's say, are here, right? So let me double check with mine. Yeah, okay. So political institutions at T are here, all right? So there's a distribution of resources, and there is a set of political institutions, right? So these two together determine what? They determine de jure political power, okay, plus de facto political power. Okay, so this is from Acemoğlu 2009 intro to modern economic growth. Okay, it's a very nice text. It's an advanced text, but you can still look at certain parts that are not really technical. So what is de jure political power? Well, and what is de facto political power? Well, de jure political power is what is written in the rules, right? And de facto political power is what is in the reality, right? So these two are determined by distribution of resources. So let me be more careful. So distribution of resources today and political institutions today together determine de jure political power and de facto political power at time t. Okay? Now, these two determine two things. One is economic institutions at t, economic institutions at time t, and the other is, where is that? Political institutions in t+1. Careful, political institutions in t+1, right? And economic institutions determine what? Economic institutions determine the distribution of resources at t+1 and economic performance. At t. Okay? So you understand the dynamical system now, right? Because now I have the political institutions at t+1 and distribution of resources in t+1 exactly as in here, right? So from 1 year to the next, or one long run to another long run, one generation to another generation, there is this causality flow, all right? So knowing that we have political institutions at t+1 and distribution of resources at t+1, they again, these two determine what? De jure political power, de facto political power at t, and these determine economic institutions at t, and this determine both economic performance at t and distribution of resources at t+1, and also they determine the political institutions at t+1. Okay, so that evolution continues in the long run, and as you see, it's a complex relationship. Why? Because in some countries, the initial distribution of resources and the initial political institutions create more democratic institutions or more inclusive institutions, right? And in some other countries, these distribution of resources and political institutions create certain a certain set of institutions that create, you know, that create only disruptions, right? That create corruption, that create exploitation of public resources for the benefit of only a few, and other political and economic ills. All right. So it depends on initial historical conditions. It depends on the cultural endowments of the society, and it depends on many other stuff, as we discussed earlier when we refer to geography, right? So if, for instance, so one example, one famous example is about land inequality. Okay, so historically, of course, modern capitalist economies evolved from, especially in the North Atlantic region, and in the for North America and Europe. So these so we observe this landowner class, right? And there's this capitalist class, and there's the working class. Okay. Now, in that evolution, land inequality matters. Why? Because the landowner class is usually against the education reforms, right? But the capitalist class is not necessarily against education reforms that that gives public schooling for a large mass of people. Why? Because eventually those workers, if they become more skillful, they are also benefiting the capitalist class, because through industrialization, machines are getting slightly more complex. So the complementarity between human capital and physical capital eventually triggers faster growth in the economy, right? So if initially land inequality is rather large, this means some landowners are very powerful, right? So distribution of resources and the political institutions where, you know, uh, imagine a imagine a European economy or European society in, let's say, 15th century, right? So if some landowners are very powerful because they own the largest amount of land, and state is usually this biggest landowner institution, right? The king or the queen. Uh, so they have this huge de facto political power. This means they design political and economic institutions for their own benefit, right? And education reforms, which will be financed through the uh, property taxes, let's say. So the state will be progressive enough to tax the landowners and use that tax revenue to finance education reforms. And that type of policy, of course, would be blocked by these powerful landowner classes. And in fact, there is some evidence that shows that in countries where initial land inequality is not that high, those countries realize earlier education reforms. So those countries realize earlier education reforms and start accumulating human capital early enough, then better human capital or slightly larger human capital affects distribution of resources here in the next generation, because now human capital is an important resource, so it is common enough and accumulating fast enough to be important. And then people with better education prospects and better educational actually endowments, they have more responsible citizens, and they have more power, more economic and political power to beat the aristocracy and to in the fight against the ancient regime, the capitalist class and the working class. Even if you believe capitalists always exploit workers, they had this common enemy, right? The common enemy was the ancient regime. So this picture overall gives you a lot of insight, and you may put many interesting stuff within that particular theory, right? So you may think of the election systems. You may think of presidential versus parliamentary regimes. You may think of military coups that, even if the de jure political power is very large, suppose that government, democratically elected government has this huge de jure political power, right? Because it is written in the constitution. So this is the government for the next 4 or 5 years. This government will run the state, right? This government will be the main executive branch. But then, if the conditions are right, then a military coup can happen, and through that military coup, the distribution of resources altered, political institutions are altered, and the de facto political power of the government is diminished, right? So even if on the written constitution the de jure political power is large enough or exceptionally large, after the military coup, the de facto political power is nothing, all right? And then that creates long-run effects on economic institutions and political institutions. So let me stop here. And if you have questions, you can now ask. Then we continue after the break, of course, with your inputs, and we're gonna look more directly at how government, as a formal institution, how does governments, how do governments affect economic outcomes, and what are the things that affect the existence of certain types of governments. Okay. All right. Think of your questions during the break. In the second hour, we're going to continue. So my time is about 2:25. So let's meet at 2:40. Okay. To continue with our second hour. All right.